Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. I'm your host, Professor Nick Giordano, and I'm glad you could join me today. If you are not already a subscriber, make sure to subscribe and follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, don't forget to visit the PAS Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends and on social media, because there's a lot of people that still have their heads buried in the sand. You know, over the last few weeks, I've been very outspoken about the coronation of Vice President Harris, from the party bosses forcing Biden off the ticket, hand-selecting the vice president without a single vote from ordinary Democrats, to what we're seeing today, and it's a constant media manipulation. They want to reimagine Kamala Harris. I have also explained the playbook that Trump and the Republican Party should be using against the Kamala Harris campaign on this podcast. But unfortunately, it seems it's fallen on deaf ears. And I've even spoken to officials off the record behind the scenes about this, not for nothing. But people can call Kamala Harris a joke all they want. But what's not a joke is the media and the Democrat machine. They are powerful entities. One of them, the legacy media, they know how to control the narrative, and the other has built a massive and impressive get-out-the-vote ground game. Shockingly, there is some enthusiasm for her. Some of you may dismiss it. Oh, it's all made up, that it's fake enthusiasm that we're witnessing. But what everyone needs to understand is that the enthusiasm is not necessarily fake. People are happy that Biden is off the ticket. They are energized now that Biden is off the ticket. And even if some of the enthusiasm is manufactured, perception often becomes reality. It seems that ordinary Democrats could care less that they didn't have any say in their candidate. They could care less that they were lied to and manipulated for years regarding President Biden's cognitive decline. It's like a bunch of lemmings that do what they're told. I mean, just take a listen to this clip at a Kamala Harris event, because it really is shockingly revealing.
What democracy looks like!
This is what democracy looks like!
Show me what democracy looks like!
This is what democracy looks like!
Show me what democracy looks like!
This is what democracy looks like!
So the person on the mic is shouting, "Show me what democracy looks like." The audience shouts back, "This is what democracy looks like." And never once does the irony dawn on them, because nothing screams democracy like party bosses shoving Biden aside, negating the votes of millions of ordinary Democrats, and handing the crown to Vice President Harris, despite the fact that she didn't get a single primary vote, despite the fact that there wasn't any type of debate, there was no challenges, and yet she gets coronated. That, my friends, is democracy at its finest. But when it comes to our republic, many of you should be concerned, because she is generating enthusiasm. It would be illogical for Republicans. There's a lot of Democrats that have their heads buried in the sand, but it would also be illogical for Republicans to do the same thing and bury their heads in the sand. You have tens of thousands of people that are attending her events, and to ignore that is illogical. Frighteningly, there are a whole lot of people, independents particularly, who are now giving her a second look. And she keeps talking about freedom, despite how her and the Democrats threaten the very freedom they claim to champion. And this is part of the problem. You have so many Republicans, so many conservatives, so many Trump supporters that are ignoring the obvious. They're ignoring what's really taking place, what's happening throughout the entire country. And it doesn't mean that Kamala Harris is going to win. But this election should not be a close race. I mean, let's be honest. When we look at the right track, wrong track numbers, over 65% of the American people believe we are on the wrong track. The president's approval rating, the current administration's approval rating, it hovers anywhere from 36 to about 40%. The election shouldn't even be close. People are miserable. They don't like what they're paying for at the grocery stores. They don't like paying the high cost of energy prices. They don't like the open borders. And yet the media is trying to reinvent and rebrand Kamala Harris as if she's the greatest thing since sliced bread. She's a goddess. She's actually positioning herself as the anti-Kamala Harris candidate. It really is stunning. But what's even more stunning is that she's getting away with it because people are losing their focus. And I want to talk about that when we get back from this quick break. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So you got a lot of people that are buying into the Kamala Harris makeover, and Trump and the Republicans underestimate them at their own peril. Given all the failures of the Democratic Party over the last 3.5 years, given how the Harris-Biden policies have wreaked chaos on our economy, they've wreaked chaos on our household budgets, given the open borders, the decline within our cities, the crime, the failing education system, the global instability that's bringing us closer to World War III, this election should be a slam dunk. And you have polls showing that on the issues, on the actual issues, especially when it comes to the economy, when it comes to the border, when it comes to the international landscape, former President Trump has a double-digit lead. In fact, Trump leads on just about every single issue with the exception of abortion and healthcare. Leads on every issue. Yet at the same time, most of the polling has Kamala Harris winning right now. More importantly, the betting markets, where in just about every betting market, Kamala Harris has even pulled even with the former president or is leading the former president. The truth is, this election is not a slam dunk. There is the very real possibility that Kamala Harris and Democrats can pull this off. And you could lie to yourself all you want. You could believe the polls are manipulated. You could believe that the betting markets are rigged. You could believe that all the images we're seeing are AI generated. You could tell yourself that all day long. But guess what? The more you Republicans and Trump convince yourselves that the polls are rigged or that Kamala Harris really doesn't stand a chance because sooner or later the honeymoon's going to be over, the more likely she is going to win. It's like I said last week, over the last 2 decades, the Democrats in the media have done an excellent job of socially engineering our society, where every issue is viewed through the prism of emotion, not through the prism of reason and logic, where voters vote based on emotion, not reason and logic. And this is Trump and the Republicans' race to lose. And if they do lose, I don't want to hear about rigged elections or anything else. What did you do out there? Trump and the Republicans should be up by 10, 15, even 20 points, but they're not. We have to recognize this. We have to admit this. We have to be honest with ourselves. And Trump isn't helping the situation. You got to call a spade a spade. Screw the nonsense about polls and crowd sizes. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. If Trump gets a question about crowd sizes, he should just say, oh my God, I can fill stadiums. What's your point? Move on. Next question. That's it. He doesn't need to engage in whose crowd sizes are bigger. He doesn't need to attack other Republicans like Georgia Governor Kemp. It's not going to help him or you win over a single new voter. In fact, it will actually cost you votes with people who are on the fence. Elections aren't complicated. It's about bringing people in to vote. The base is already with Trump, so there's no need to throw out the red meat that the base likes. That may be good for his supporters, but it's not going to motivate a single independent voter to vote for him. I said last week, the focus should be on her failed policies versus his policies. Keep it simple. That's all you have to do. This isn't rocket science. Do you want to pay more for food or less? Do you want to pay more to heat your home or less? Do you want to pay more to fill up your car with gas or less? Do you want millions of people streaming across the border or not? Do you want to see $465 billion of your hard-earned tax dollars going to illegal immigrants for their food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, and so much more as you, the American people, are struggling to put food on your table, as you're struggling to pay your bills? Do you want elected officials to continue to put those illegally here before American citizens? Do you want safer streets? Do you want global stability and an end to the billions of dollars being transferred overseas to other countries? It's a very simple formula that needs to be followed. And if Trump and the Republicans stick to that, they win. That's it. Trump's speeches, they should be no longer than 40 to 45 minutes, strictly focus on the failed Harris-Biden policies, focus on our incompetence, focus on why his policies are better, present a vision of optimism, and make sure the American people know that a Harris-Walz presidential ticket is far more dangerous than the Biden-Harris administration. The media and the Democrats, they've taken gaslighting to a whole new level. You have the vice president going out there in speech after speech. Well, Actually, in all honesty, it's the same exact speech. It's a 17-minute speech given at every rally because they have to keep her on teleprompter. But you now have her positioning herself as being tough on the border, tough on illegal immigration. Are you kidding me? That's preposterous. I give the Democrats and the media credit for having the cojones to completely reinvent her. They took the chance, and as of right now, it's paying off. It's working. Now you have Harris announcing no tax on tips to win over service workers. Where have I heard that before? Oh, that's right. It's part of the Trump campaign platform. They literally are stealing his policies and passing them off as their own. That's plagiarism. That's what got Biden kicked out of the 1988 presidential race, because he plagiarized. You have Kamala Harris plagiarizing from Trump's campaign, saying no tax on tips. Meanwhile, the Inflation Reduction Act, the one championed by Biden and Harris, and as a matter of fact, Harris was the tie-breaking vote, included provisions to crack down on service workers' tips through stricter reporting requirements. Now she wants to say no tax on tips? She keeps telling her audience that on day one, she's going to target companies and lower the cost of food and energy. Well, where have you been for the last 3.5 years? Why haven't you done it already? You said a year ago, 2 years ago, even 3 years ago, that you were going to tackle the high prices. And that was Vice President Kamala Harris that said it. Well, where has she been? But again, it doesn't matter, because what they're doing is working. Because so many are taking their eye off the ball, and you got a complicit media that acts as an extension, as the DNC. And you have a lot of Americans that are falling for it hook, line, and sinker. They don't ask questions. They don't look into past policy positions. They don't look at the effect of the current Harris-Biden policies. None of that matters to them. And that should frighten you out there. For everyone that thinks the American people are smarter than that, think back to the pandemic, where the overwhelming majority of people supported lockdowns, masks, school closures, and the vax mandate. The overwhelming majority. Now, despite being lied to, despite being threatened and coerced, not a single person was ever held accountable. Not a single person. Even though things were just simply made up, right? Lord Fauci came out, admitted the 6-foot distancing rule completely made up. No basis in science whatsoever. They destroyed our education system, shutting schools down for 2 years in some cases. Disaster. But it seems like most Americans are okay with that. And I tell you this so you can understand the mindset of many Americans. Just look at how she called for an end of fracking, and now, according to her campaign, she doesn't want to end fracking. And how many millions of Pennsylvanians are just going to accept it without question? How many of them? They say that the Harris-Walz campaign is a campaign of optimism, that it's based on joy. When the Democrats and the media talk about joy, it reminds me of the chilling sentiments of Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum. You will own nothing and be happy. If you listen to their campaign, it's not about joy. It's about instilling fear. Trump is the next Hitler. We're never going to have another election if he gets elected. That democracy will be dead. It will be the end of the republic. That nearly half the Trump supporters are these radical, violent extremists that need to be targeted. If you really look at the Harris-Walz ticket, it's not a ticket about joy and freedom. It's a ticket about empowering the government. And what really aggravates me the most is how Kamala Harris, the Democrats, and the media have successfully co-opted freedom. Kamala Harris is using freedom as the defining issue in her campaign. In her speeches, she repeats that her campaign is about freedom, compassion, and the rule of law, when the reality is that it's the exact opposite. Over the last decade or so, the Democratic Party has become the anti-freedom party. And I'm going to explain that when we get back from this quick break. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back. Are you prepared for the unexpected? As a former emergency manager, being prepared is not a choice, it's a necessity, and that's where the Wellness Company comes in. Imagine having the peace of mind that you're equipped to handle any medical crisis, from tick bites to the latest pandemic. The Wellness Company's medical emergency kit is your lifeline, packed with essential medications like ivermectin, emergency antibiotics, antivirals, and more. This kit is your ultimate preparedness solution. The Wellness Company's team of renowned medical professionals, including Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. James Thorpe, Dr. Harvey Risch, Dr. Drew Pinsky, and more. They are truth-seeking doctors, and they have designed a kit that sets the gold standard for safety and prevention. Don't wait for the next crisis to strike. Visit twc.health/PAS and use promo code PAS for an exclusive 10% discount just for being a listener of this show. Prepare today, rest easy tomorrow. Use code PAS at checkout. Welcome back, everyone. So when it comes to the vice president, her list of failures is long. It's not hard to do the research, whether it's crime, open borders, international affairs. No one can honestly name any policy successes. Now, this is a person that was a senator for several years, and this is a person that has served as vice president of the United States for the last 3.5 years. And what has she accomplished? Just think. And I talk to a Democrat. Ask them, say, name an accomplishment. They'll be like, oh, she was the first black vice president of the United States. That's not an accomplishment. That's not an accomplishment. An accomplishment is that you actually successfully did something, that you actually implemented a policy that actually benefited the American people. What has she accomplished? She has a proven track record of failure. That's what she has. But the freedom thing is what really bothers me, because I have been watching and warning about the ever-growing surveillance state. The fact is that it's not speculative of what a Harris-Walz administration will do when it comes to our basic freedoms. The freedom to speak freely, the freedom to worship, the freedom to possess a firearm, the freedom to have your own private health insurance, the freedom to choose the school that best fits our child's needs, the right to privacy, the right of girls and women to compete in their own sports without having their hard work, sacrifice, and dedication undermined by men, the right of women and young girls to apply for female-only scholarships without some man stealing those scholarships. And the fact is that for over 3 years, the Harris-Biden administration has been unrelenting in their attacks on our basic freedoms. She's called for mandatory gun buyback programs. She has called for abolishing private health insurance. She has called for open borders and to abolish ICE, Immigration's Custom Enforcement. She's called for a ban on fracking. Again, this is not hard to research. You can find it online and in her own words. You don't need to take my word for it. Look it up yourselves. This is someone who has little regard for freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of expression. Not only does she support massive censorship throughout social media, but they actively work to suppress the voices of millions of Americans. They have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to build out censorship programs designed to target anyone who goes against their narratives. And when I say narratives, this censorship effort extends far beyond anything you could imagine. It extends to every issue, from the pandemic to climate change to gender to elections to banking policies to the war in Ukraine, so many other issues. It's all about power, but they couch their intent behind the idea of misinformation and disinformation. They couch their intent behind the idea of hate speech and threats against democracy. Harris herself has been a vocal critic of free speech. She has explained how social media platforms should be accountable for what she deems as hate infiltrating their platforms. Quote, "We will hold social media platforms accountable for the hate infiltrating their platforms because they have a responsibility to help fight against this threat to our democracy," end quote. Now, people may be like, oh, well, it's good. We should get rid of hate speech on the social media platforms. But what constitutes hate speech? Ask yourselves that. Remember, in 2024, using the words illegal immigrant, illegal alien can be deemed hateful. So you could see how easily they manipulate regular speech and label it as extremist speech. If you don't buy into the narrative that there are more than two genders, well, that's considered extremist. You're considered transphobic. They know how to manipulate these things. And it's a clear indication of their intent to redefine what free speech is. They are pushing the notion that speech, particularly speech they disagree with, is not constitutionally protected. That speech that they disagree with is hateful and offensive. Therefore, they must protect you from it. You have Governor Tim Walz, who Harris picked as her running mate, who has demonstrated that he has no regard for civil liberties. During the pandemic, he set up a snitch line and encouraged family members and neighbors to report on each other. We saw this here in New York City. They had to stop it because New Yorkers, we're a finicky bunch. A lot of people are sending very naughty pictures to the alert system. They also tried to do this in Oregon and Washington and Vermont. And what does it do? It's more, this type of tactic is more reminiscent of totalitarian regimes where the government fosters distrust among its citizens. And think about that. Think about how bad that is when you encourage citizens to spy on each other and snitch on each other. Think about the culture that they're creating. This is what you saw in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It's what you see in North Korea, Communist China, Russia, Venezuela, or any other totalitarian regime that exists out there. So these actions show a clear pattern. The Democrats repeatedly insist that there's no absolute guarantee to free speech. They're attempting to redefine what free speech means, and they want to limit it. They're limiting it under the guise of combating hate speech and misinformation. But this isn't about protecting democracy. It's about controlling the narrative and silencing dissent. They love power and control, and a Harris-Walz administration will simply take these policies already created and bring them to a whole other level. Keep in mind that the foundation has already been laid and built out more than 3 years ago. It's not just about what they say. It's about the policies that they have already implemented to rein in our freedoms. And that's what I want to talk about when we get back from this quick break. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So some are going to argue that words are words and politicians say things they don't really mean. Some are going to argue that there's nothing wrong with flip-flopping on the issues. However, in Kamala Harris's case, it's not just flip-flopping on issues. It's not that she said something 20 years ago and her mindset has changed. It's that she said many of these things a few years ago and is now reversing herself on literally everything and actually stealing President Trump's ideas. But more to the point, Kamala Harris is attempting to position herself as the anti-Kamala Harris. But it's not just about what she says or doesn't say. The real concern I have is about her anti-freedom policies that this administration has already implemented, and that's where the concern should lie with every single American, including those who may be supportive of Harris. Most Americans are not paying attention to what is going on in Britain right now, but they should, because a Harris-Walz administration is going to seek to do the same here. Over the last several days, Britain has been mired in violent protests over its failed immigration policies, and many British people are concerned that their culture is being wiped out, that the politicians are more concerned with political correctness than they are of the British people and the thousands of years of a rich and vibrant culture. And they have a right to be concerned. Politicians should not be surprised that when you ignore the concerns of your citizens for so long, resentment builds and a powder keg forms. All it takes is one little spark to blow the powder keg. And that's what led to the recent riots that we're witnessing. People protesting the immigration policies, and then because they're being ignored, you have some taking advantage and instigating violence and destruction. But my focus isn't on British immigration policies. It's not on the protests or the riots. That's on the British people to figure out themselves. What I do care about is Britain's war on speech that's been occurring long before the current flare-up. Over the years, the United Kingdom has been cracking down on what it deems as harmful speech, and this has led to arrests and legal actions against individuals who express their viewpoints online. Understand that in Britain, they do not have a constitutional right of free speech. While we view freedom of speech as a God-given right, and we've enshrined it in the Bill of Rights within the United States Constitution, they don't view it that way. Our founders understood that it's why we fought a revolution. They understood that you could not have a free society without free speech. See, free speech isn't meant to just protect speech you agree with. That's easy to do. It was meant to protect speech that you disagree with, protect speech that may be offensive, may be harmful, speech that you might find revolting, vile, distasteful. The way the founders saw it, you protect speech by having more of it, not less, calling out those who are offensive and hateful, refute their ideas, win people over through the power of argument and persuasion. That's not the case in Britain, where people have been and are being rounded up for what the powers that be deem offensive. And you could go back over a decade to see how ridiculous it's actually become in Britain. You had a college student, this is going back, I think, like 14 years, a college student getting arrested for calling a policeman's horse gay. Another person was arrested for mocking dead soldiers. Distasteful, I'm not going to lie, that's disgusting. but shouldn't have been arrested for it. Another person was arrested for wearing an anti-police shirt. Another person was arrested for calling someone a leprechaun. I mean, geez, the way me and my friends talk to each other, we'd all be in prison right now. Or what about the person arrested for protesting outside a Scientology center with a sign calling for Scientology a cult? For God's sakes, you had a woman arrested for simply telling authorities that 16 years of immigration has ruined her neighborhood. Now, some of these cases were dropped because they were so preposterous. There was outrage amongst the public. And while some will argue that since the cases were dropped, it shows that the system works, that's evidence that the system works, they're deliberately ignoring the absurdity and, even worse, the real intent to control speech and thereby controlling people's thoughts. It's a bullying tactic, plain and simple. It's a bullying tactic that's designed to instill fear and chill freedom of expression. And the fact is that once speech becomes a target, you have these power-hungry fools in office. Officials will always find more ways, new ways, intrusive ways to regulate what people can and cannot say. Insulting, hateful, and offensive speech should never be criminalized. I don't condone that type of speech, but it should not be criminalized because there will always be someone that finds something offensive. People have no lives. For God's sakes, they got mad that Aunt Jemima was on a pancake box and a syrup bottle. They got rid of Uncle Ben because someone found it offensive. Or the Land O'Lakes Indian lady. There's always going to be some moron out there that's going to find things offensive, that's easily going to construe what you say as insulting. And that's why hateful or offensive speech should never be criminalized, because it's too easy to weaponize the criminalization of speech by those in power. Remember, it's always those in power who are going to be the ones to determine what's hateful and what's offensive. Restricting speech is nothing more than a tool to silence critics and oppress their points of view, especially when those points of view deviate from government-approved narratives. The governments have grown much bolder over the last decade in the name of what they call combating misinformation, disinformation, despite the fact that governments are the largest purveyors of misinformation and disinformation, and that's been true throughout history. And I want someone here to tell me, what is the difference between the liberal democracy over in the United Kingdom and Venezuela? Because I want you to consider how Maduro has ordered anyone who participates in anti-Maduro election protests can be arrested and go to jail. In Britain, a Belfast judge refused bail to someone who was watching the riots. They weren't engaged in the riots, they were watching the riots. And the judge said that it doesn't matter whether you're an active participant or, quote, a curious observer, you are going to be locked up. Think about how remarkable that is and tell me, what is the difference between the Maduro regime and British authorities at this point? We have reports that British authorities are now scouring social media, not only targeting what people say, but also targeting what people are reposting. So if you simply repost something that the authorities don't like, well, that can be considered a crime, and as a result, you could get arrested and be prosecuted. Now, some of you may be wondering, why are you talking so much about Britain? Where are you going with this? You're thinking, that can't possibly happen in the United States. Well, guess what? I got news for everyone. It already is happening in the United States. Not to the level it's happening at Britain, but the groundwork was laid with the Harris-Biden administration's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, where this strategy is a blueprint for a surveillance state where the government monitors and scrutinizes its citizen under the guise of preventing domestic terrorism. The Harris-Biden administration has been using this strategy to label ordinary Americans as potential domestic terrorists simply for exercising their constitutional rights, whether it's attending school board meetings to voice concerns about what your children are learning, whether it's questioning the integrity of our elections. You are being surveilled and treated as threats. Oh, you're just exaggerating, Professor Giordano. That's not really happening. Yeah, you think so? Well, why don't you go ask Tulsi Gabbard, who got placed on a terror watch list? Why don't you ask her if I'm exaggerating? Why don't you ask the 75-year-old Paulette Harlow, who is sentenced to 2 years in prison, 75 years old, sentenced to 2 years in prison because she dared to enter and protest in an abortion clinic? And the left screams, well, she invaded and she was blockading the clinic. What a bunch of horse you-know-what. How many protests, pro-Hamas protests, have we seen at the Capitol Rotunda? How many of them are doing 2-year sentences? How many of them are doing 2-year prison sentences? Not a single one. You had pro-Hamas protesters taking over college campuses, commandeering buildings, not letting students attend their classes, take their finals. They destroyed property. And what happened? Most of the charges were dropped against them. This isn't speculation or fear-mongering. We have seen concrete actions taken by this administration, and it shows what their intentions are. I encourage every single one of you, don't take my word for it. Read the document yourself. It's only 32 pages. And guess what? If you take out the title page, the table of contents, and the back cover, it's 28 pages. Read it. See for yourselves what it talks about. See how anyone that expresses anti-government or anti-authority sentiment can be labeled as a potential domestic violent extremist. See how they never define what is considered anti-government or anti-authority sentiment. The slightest criticism of government or its policies could get you in trouble. So you could call to globalize the intifada all you want. You could chant death to America all you want. You could talk about taking down, bringing down the United States, destroying it. That's fine. But if you criticize the government or you criticize government policies, well, that could get you in trouble. And then it talks about what they deem as incitement, that even if you are not directly engaged, your words can be used to incite others and undermine American democracy. But incite is never defined as well. And it sounds reminiscent of what the British judge said, that you don't necessarily have to be engaged yourself. Just being a bystander could get you in trouble. If you read the national strategy, it talks about controlling the supply and demand of information online. It talks about the private sector serving as the government's eyes and ears. It talks about getting family members and members of the community serve as informants. It's all laid out. Couple that with the hundreds of millions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, being funded to our universities to build out massive censorship apparatus and develop tools that are going to monitor and restrict our discourse. So we're using tax dollars to censor ourselves. For example, the University of Wisconsin was awarded $5 million grant by the National Science Foundation to develop a system that could detect and strategically correct what the government perceives as misinformation related to the pandemic, elections, and vaccines. This is on top of the previous $7.5 million grant awarded by the National Science Foundation to 10 universities to develop anti-misinformation tools as part of the Trust and Authenticity in Communication Systems initiative. Well, what about how the Department of Homeland Security created disinformation groups at Stanford University and the University of Washington to censor political speech leading up to the 2020 election? Now, under this partnership, higher education institutions, they served as the conduits between the government and big tech to remove speech, to censor the American people, censor anyone that government officials found unacceptable. The erosion of our freedom is happening right before our eyes. It's happening under the banner of protecting what they deem as democracy. But make no mistake, this is not about protecting democracy, freedom, or the republic. It's about consolidating power. When a government starts to dictate what is acceptable speech and what isn't, when it begins to surveil its own citizens and encourages them to turn on each other, it is no longer a democracy, but an authoritarian regime in the making. This administration's actions are antithetical to the very concept, to the very founding principles of our country. It goes against everything we are supposed to stand for, and it's only going to get worse under a Harris-Walz administration. They want us to believe that they are our protectors, the guardians of freedom. But in reality, they are the petty elites who believe that we, the people, cannot be trusted to say, think, or do the right thing. And they demand that we submit and surrender to their will, unquestionably obey their edicts. And then, only then, do we get to enjoy the freedoms they allow us to. Freedoms that are conditional, they're limited, and it's subject to their whims. Our freedom to speak and worship, bear arms, and live our lives without undue government interference is not something that should be taken for granted. But sadly, it is. And Americans better wake up now and realize what's going on, because in less than 3 months, we are going to have one of the most pivotal elections in our lifetime, if not the most pivotal election in our lifetime. And if the Harris-Walz administration ever gets into power, it's going to be a very dark future for the United States. Don't ever underestimate the power of the media and the Democratic machine to shape narratives. As of right now, they have successfully rebranded Kamala Harris. Whether or not that holds remains to be seen. But if Republicans, the Trump campaign, and just ordinary people if they don't accept the reality of what's happening right now, if they want to deny what everyone is witnessing, if they want to keep their heads buried in the sand, they're giving her a much better chance to win this election. Now, if you found the content of this episode informative, please leave the P.A.S. report a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Take 30 seconds to write a review and share this episode with your family and friends and on social media. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back next week with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.